Our speaker today, Larry Herzog, has been a professor at San Diego State University since 1989, so his 30th anniversary is this year. So congratulations, Larry. He's originally from New York City, went to SUNY Albany and got a Ph.D. at Syracuse. And fun fact about him is that he was the captain of his soccer team. I don't know if he still plays these days, but he's a hard charger. His wife is Denise, who's here today. Denise, where are you? There she is. They have a child who's going to be married soon in Seattle, we understand, so congratulations for that. And they live in Bay Park. Larry is a professor, of city planning at the School of Public Affairs at SDSU, and also a consultant and a writer specializing in planning, urban design, and sustainable development in the U.S., Mexico, and Latin America. He's written or edited 10 books on urban and environmental design and global and cross-border development, most recently a book called Global Suburbs. He's been a senior Fulbright Scholar in Peru and a senior Fulbright lecturer in Britain. He also served as an urban and regional planning consultant to the U.S. Agency for International Development in Peru and Bolivia, and to the American Institute of Architects and the U.S. EPA and the U.S. Embassy in Mexico. Also at the U.S. Consulate in Tijuana and the Public Policy Institute of California. Dr. Herzog was a TEDx speaker at the 2015 event, TEDx Monumento 258 on the U.S.-Mexico border, and won the 2017 Faculty Monty Award for scholarship and teaching at San Diego State. And one other thing to look for is he has a podcast called Whose City? So we'll look for that. The next 4th edition of that will be out soon. So Larry, welcome to Friends of San Diego Architecture. I'm looking forward to your talk, and of course we planned this to occur just the day after Donald Trump and his announcement on the emergency of the border. So we're on top of things in this organization.
Okay, well, good morning. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you to Friends of San Diego Architecture for organizing this. Thanks to everyone who came out. I know it's a national emergency, so I know you had to struggle to get here this morning. So thank you for coming, and thanks to the Friends of San Diego Architecture for organizing this. I think I'm going to lower the lights, as I tell my students, romantic lighting. So. Is that too dark, or is that okay? Yeah. You're better off looking at my slides than looking at me. So, well, the subject of the border wall is obviously a household topic today. But I've been thinking about this and writing about this for many years. So this is not a new subject for me in a way, and it just happens to be a coincidence that they rescheduled my talk, which was going to occur later in the spring, for today, literally the day after the president of the most powerful country in the world declared a national emergency to construct this border wall. So it's kind of timely for me to share with you some of the thinking that I have on the subject. So what I want to do this morning is kind of weave a story about the border and the wall and urban space, and kind of pull together various strands of work that I've been doing for the last several decades. I wrote a book in 1990 called Where North Meets South, Cities, Space, and Politics on the U.S.-Mexico border. And at the time, not very many people were writing about the border, and almost no one was writing about cities. So the first point is that, in fact, there are about 10 million people living in cities literally right on the boundary, and about 20 million more who live within a 2-hour drive of the U.S.-Mexico border. So this is not the land of sunshine, adobe, and silence that it was 150 years ago when a historian coined that phrase about the border. This is not an isolated place. It is a thriving, urbanized boundary with billions of dollars of economic activities and millions of people who cross it on a daily or weekly basis. So it's a very important place for urban planners, architects, designers, landscape architects, policymakers, and others to really think carefully about what kinds of policies we construct along this frontier. And so what I want to do this morning is tackle that question in the context of what this border really is, not what some elected official or politician imagines it to be or wants to use it for in some other way, but what actually happens here, and how can we think about this place, and how can we think about making policies along this frontier. So my talk is what I call a cross-border view of urban space, and I'm going to start by asking you to think about the border at 3 scales, and then I will eventually talk about the transfrontier metropolis, Tijuana, San Diego being one of the most important. And finally, I want to talk about something called placemaking, because it's a very new idea that architects, planners, urban writers, and other professionals are talking about now as a way to make cities and neighborhoods and communities work better. We're doing a lot of placemaking here in the San Diego, Tijuana region, and we need to focus on that because that's the reality of where we are in the 21st century. So, let me begin by asking this question. How do we think about a border? Well, we can think about the border as 3 things. Obviously, it's a line. In Spanish, they talk about la línea. A lot of times you'll hear in Tijuana, nos vamos a la línea. We're going to the line. So it's a physical line across land. But it's also a region, cross-border region. And nowadays, we have this thing that I call the cross-border metropolis, or the transfrontier metropolis. In Spanish, la metrópolis transfronteriza. So the most important thing on the bottom of that slide is that the border is a place. It's a living space. You're in it right now. We're part of that region. We are residents here. We live in this region. And millions of people across this frontier work, trade, engage in business, have families on both sides of the border. This is a living, thriving, dynamic international frontier. And that's what I want to focus on today. So the first scale is that, yes, there is a line there. Sometimes that line has these fences and walls on it. So where does that line come from? Why do we have boundaries? So again, forgive me for being a little bit professorly. I'll try not to be too professorly this morning, but we created boundaries in the 19th century when we passed a set of international laws creating the things that we call nation states. And nation states, one of the legal aspects of a nation state was that it would have sovereignty. It would have legal control. Oops. I think we now have no working. Okay. That was supposed to happen at the end, but I guess it's happening sooner. So we have the idea of the nation state. If anyone wants to try to find a battery for the microphones, I'll be happy to use it. If not, I'll just use my voice. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. All right.
This is better, the speaker's too loud.
Yeah, I'm used to speaking to large groups of people. They're called students, and we have a lot of them out at San Diego State. And I think there's a few of my students in the room here. So the idea of a border line or a boundary line was created during a period of late 19th century creation of nation states and a set of laws and international trade rules, taxes and duties and restrictions, immigration laws started to be created. So that's where the idea of a physical line came from. So the line is a real thing, but it was understood from very early on that these lines and these laws and these rules had to be negotiated between nation states. And most historians and scholars talk about two very distinct periods. The first period, before 1950, was the period right up to the end and just after World War II. And that's often been referred to, as one scholar called it, the shelter function of boundaries, where the lines were protective kind of skins that surrounded nation states and were defining territory and protecting territory, and two world wars were fought over the fact that some interests tried to move across those lines very aggressively, creating war. So World War I and World War II, in some sense, were wars that were fought over boundaries and over aggression across boundaries. But after 1950, most historians speak of the shift toward a period of globalization and cross-border spaces, or something called a post-shelter function. And we've seen massive amounts of trade, the movement of workers across boundaries, the end of most major world wars, the increase of cross-border technology. You can travel, you can communicate, you can trade across borders. You can go on your computer right now while I'm speaking and buy something in France and have it shipped to your house, and it'll be there maybe tomorrow. So it's a very different world than it was prior to the middle of the last century. So we've shifted from a world of lines where nation states define everything to a world where there are many more kinds of global relationships. So we have to understand our border in the context of these larger shifts that have occurred around the world. Now, in the post-1950 period, as I mentioned, there's a lot more large scale. We have the ability to transcend boundaries with technology, especially military technology. We can communicate on a global scale. We can move around quickly on a global scale. People can travel to work across boundaries legally in many cases and illegally as well. And then we have these global markets and global trade. So the world has become a very different place. Whether or not some political interest groups want to accept that, that is the reality, and that's not going away. So the pre-1950 world, the world where walls define borders, are things that are very historic now. Tourists go to China to look at the Great Wall of China, but it's not a real thing. It's a wall that was built at a different time in history, 200 BC to 1400 AD. And it defined the vision that ruling dynasties had in trying to protect themselves against invasions, and now it's a tourism site. Hadrian's wall was built by the Roman Empire in 120 AD to also protect Rome from what were seen as the raging barbarians coming from the northern regions. I guess they're like soccer thugs today. And it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site as well. And then, of course, the Berlin Wall, which is probably the most powerful metaphor for the end of an era, right? It had a shelter function as well. It was one political state trying to keep people in from leaving and also trying to keep people outside from coming in. And it was torn down in 1989 and very much seen as kind of the end of an era, if you will. And our border here along the U.S.-Mexico boundary was created after the war, 1846 U.S.-Mexico War, and it was a way in which the two countries agreed to divide up territory, although that agreement probably wasn't fully absorbed by one side. Mexico did not feel 100% convinced that they wanted to do that, but they didn't have a choice. The war ended, and they cut a deal with the United States so they could have peace. And they created this nearly 2,000-mile wall, which has about 700 miles of fences today. Not really walls, but fences, as we know. Enough said on that subject. So what does the line mean, and what are the issues that relate to the line? You often hear in the news and in discussions these days that the line is a skin that will protect the United States, in this case, from things like smuggling, or immigration, or it will protect national security, and it will define our sovereignty. But in fact, we have to ask the question, are these really line issues only? And the answer, like if you look at drug smuggling, narcotics experts will tell you that when you speak about drugs, you can't only look at the supply side, there's also demand for drugs as part of the problem. So if you look at this map that might be a little difficult to see here, it shows all the major trafficking routes around the world and how drugs can move quickly across the world based on supply and demand. Who's trying to get certain types of drugs at certain periods of time and where they then end up flowing. So trying to stop drugs even at a border doesn't really speak to the larger issue, which is who's demanding the drugs. So many experts will say that if you want to stop narcotics from entering the United States, you have to attack the demand side, why people are so addicted to opiates and other drugs in the United States, which is one of the largest drug consumers on the planet. So really have to look at it as a supply-demand relationship, and the line is only one small part of the story. Same thing with immigration. When you talk about immigration, immigration is also a labor supply-demand relationship as well. There's a huge demand in the United States for people to work in certain industries that can't find workers inside the United States. That's why so many people have been coming from Mexico, Central America, and other parts of the world. They're not coming there by accident. They're coming there because they know that somebody wants their work. So when you talk about immigrants, you have to talk about who's hiring them also. And so there is a supply-demand relationship along the U.S.-Mexico border. I call it a social system. There's a social system that's been going on for 150 years. There's a demand for workers in sectors like agriculture, construction, service industries like hotels, and there's a supply of those workers coming from Mexico. It's been going on for a long time. It's not something new, and they find a way in. Okay? They don't necessarily climb over a wall to get there either. I love this cartoon. It's been smuggled in from Mexico, and I've been addicted to it for years. And everyone thinks it's drugs. And it's workers, right? I have that on my door at my office at SDSU. So the irony of how we think about the border and what we think is going on versus the reality of it is an important lesson for all of us. Even national security. So after 9/11, we created the Department of Homeland Security, and we put a lot of emphasis on Homeland Security along the southern border, right? But it turns out that the terrorists who came into the United States, they didn't come across the Mexican border. They weren't hiding in cafes in Tijuana and sneaking across the border into the United States. They came across the Canadian border, and they came by plane, in many cases, as legal immigrants. So a 20 to 30-foot wall would not have kept out the terrorists who caused the 9/11 event. The other thing about international security is that the best way to make the United States, one of the best ways to make the United States safer is to have better relationships in the places where terrorists are being cultivated. And there was some conversation about going and talking to people in the Middle East, to these little schools that are hidden in the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and really having a dialogue with people so we could better understand each other. Building a wall, in a way, is almost like saying, we don't care about you. And this is our response to the political climate in the 21st century. And I'm not sure that's the best approach here. So I would say that another piece in that story is what might be called place-based explanations and place-based negotiation with the places where terrorism is growing on the planet. Furthermore, whether or not you can actually defend a wall is also up in question, as we know, because there are many technologies that allow us to transcend a physical wall, whether it's digging underground tunnels, of which there are now hundreds across the U.S.-Mexico border, I think 80 just in the California border area. Some of them cost $2 to $3 million each to build, and they're very sophisticated. They have a whole system of transportation, lighting, plumbing, you name it. Pretty soon they'll be putting condos in those tunnels under the border. So a wall is pretty, in a way, fairly irrelevant. And then, of course, you have drones and other technologies that allow you to transcend the frontier at a height that no wall could ever really stop. So moving from the line, which we now see is not just a line, there are things going on that transcend the line, we have to really talk about this as a region, because it's a region that has had a relationship for a very long time. hundreds of years, people have been transcending this frontier and thinking about this place as a cross-border region. And the thing that really defines this cross-border region is economic interdependence. Markets, industry, transnational banking, the flow of labor, legal labor. You may remember during World War II, there was a legal program to allow Mexican workers to come in and work in sectors where the United States didn't have workers at that time because they were off fighting in the war. So we actually at times have invited workers to come into the United States. People cross the border for tourism, and we have these things called maquilas, which are producing many of the things, the clothing that you're wearing right now, the electronic equipment that you're using right now, that cell phone that you're fact-checking my lecture as we speak, is probably assembled possibly assembled somewhere in another part of the world, maybe on the border. So the United States and Mexico trade volume is about $500 billion a year, and it produces millions and millions of jobs. So our economic interdependence is what connects us across this border. And I call the border zone kind of like a facilitator, because a lot of the trade that occurs by train or truck is done at the border. And I sort of see the border as kind of like a circuit breaker that receives materials, allows these things to occur. Customs brokers, there are all these different jobs and industries that are involved in facilitating this $500 billion cross-border relationship we have with Mexico. And here, just right here on our border, 35 million vehicles, 2 million trucks a year, $140 billion in merchandise just in the Baja California border region per year, 71 million passengers in cars, 100,000 workers a day. So there's a very dynamic flow of people crossing this border on a daily and weekly basis. So it's kind of a global economic gateway, if you will, a transit point for these import-export flows, and a connector that allows all these different things to happen. And so we spend a lot of money, the federal government, highway transportation, different sectors of the federal government have been paying for infrastructure to facilitate this connection, whether it's rail improvements, ports of entry. You've seen all the construction down at the San Diego-Tijuana border, the building of the new PED West facility, the remodeling of the San Isidro border crossing, and other ports of entry along the border, customs houses, brokers, is constantly being rebuilt and redesigned to make it work better, because it's allowing all of this trade to occur along the border. And Mexico is our second largest trade partner after Canada. And most of the trade that occurs along the border, if you look at the surface flows between states, occurs on the southern border. So the two largest states for exchanging goods are Texas and California. And as you know, the assembly plant industry, which assembles products, many of which come from the United States, but also from other companies in Germany and other places, Japan and other places in the world, the workers that assemble those products on the border has grown from 1970, when it first started, and had about 20,000 workers, to into the 21st century, when it had over 750,000 workers, and increasing the value of the sector as high as $250 billion per year. So this leads me to the idea of a cross-border city. Given all this economic activity that's going on, the history and cultural linkages between cities along the border, large cities, as you saw on the slide I presented at the beginning of this lecture, I think we now need to talk about a cross-border view of space. How are these cities connected, and how can we understand this connection in the future? So, again, there are these twin cities, or sister cities, as some people have called them: San Diego, Tijuana, Calexico, Mexicali, Yuma, San Luis, the two Nogales, El Paso, Juarez, we heard a lot about them recently, Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass, the two Laredos, McAllen and Reynosa, and in Brownsville, Matamoros. These are all very substantial sized cities, some larger than the other, but the total population, as I mentioned before, between 8 and 10 million people are living in these twin cities, if you will, along the frontier. And Many of them have had very, very powerful relationships. They're quite close. People have been crossing the border back and forth, families on both sides, politicians that know each other. Along the Texas border, you sometimes hear the term barbecue politics, because that's how they would work out their local problems in the two Laredos. The mayor of Nuevo Laredo would come to the mayor of Laredo's house and have a barbecue and talk about, what are we going to do about this problem or that problem? And so for many, many years, there's been kind of an informal cross-border relationship because they know each other. They're neighbors. They're friends. It's not like they're enemies and they never speak to each other. This is a dynamic relationship that's been going on for more than a century. So in 1990, I coined the term the transfrontier metropolis because I said, okay, it's not a perfect concept. I'm not saying that cities are perfectly integrated. There's a couple of scholars who have written books criticizing my 1990 book, saying, oh, he idealized this. I never said it was a perfect transfrontier metropolis. I said it was a vision. My vision was that sometime in the future, we should recognize, just like Minneapolis-St. Paul is not a perfect relationship either, but we call it the Twin Cities. And they sit on one side of the, St. Paul's on one side of the Mississippi River, and Minneapolis is on the other side of the Mississippi River, and there are bridges across the river, and people commute back and forth. Each one is a separate city. They have their own government. They have separate mayors, but they're part of a twin city region, and they have a lot of interaction. They share the river. They share air pollution issues. They share work issues, safety issues. They have different police departments, but they work together to control crime together. And by the same token, many border cities share a river, the Rio Grande River. El Paso's on one side. Ciudad Juarez is on the other side. San Diego and Tijuana are on either side of a border, but they're these sort of twin cities. And my view is that if you have 3 million people living on the San Diego side and 2+ million people on the Tijuana side, if you include Ensenada, it's almost 6 million in the transfrontier region. First of all, these places are stronger if they're together. They represent a larger market. They can compete with other cities on the West Coast. If they work together, they already share workers, they already share many economic interactions. Why not think of yourself as a single region? Now, of course, there are problems, different languages, different political systems. There are many problems, but we have, at times in the San Diego-Tijuana region, we have had enlightened leaders going all the way back to the 80s. Lucy Calea, if you remember her, she was a state politician and became a city council person. She believed that we needed to connect across the border. She created a group called Fronteras. And other folks have come along. We even had a mayor who also wanted to open an office in Tijuana and really start to talk the two cities. Our current mayor as well believes in the power of this cross-border relationship. So these cities are joined in their economic, ecological, and daily interactions. We share the same air, we share the same water, we share the same land. If there's a giant natural hazard like an earthquake, both sides are going to be affected. During the wildfires, there were fires coming across the border from Mexico, and actually Mexico sent their firefighters to help us. And we have gone and helped them during emergencies as well. So even though the border is a dividing line in terms of dividing two nation states, we are increasingly joined together, sharing so many important daily life, economic, cultural, ecological issues, that it makes sense for us to begin to think of ourselves in this larger way. And there are structural components of our cross-border metropolis. I've written about them. Things like the fact that people work on both sides of the border. Americans go to Tijuana to work. There are Americans who are managers of maquila plants that are located in Tijuana, and they drive across the border to check on how things are going every day. So they're, in effect, commuting to a job in Tijuana. There are Americans who are involved in building housing in Tijuana. There are Americans who are involved in helping manage other economic activities on the Mexican side of the border, joint partnerships. And there are Mexicans who have legal jobs where they cross the border into the United States. They're called commuter workers. And all the way back in 1964, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that if you had a green card, you were actually allowed to live on the Mexican side of the border. I don't know if you guys know that, but you can live on the Mexican side of the border if you have a green card, and you're commuting to work every day. They argued that commuting to work every day constituted a recognition that you were, in fact, living in the United States within a commuting zone that happened to be on the other side of the boundary, but within a functional space that connected the two zones together. So, in fact, the Supreme Court ruled that Mexican commuter workers who have green cards could live in Mexico and work in the United States as long as they could prove that they were crossing the border on a regular basis. People cross the border to shop in both directions. They cross the border as tourists. They have these factories that I already mentioned. Our ecosystem is connected, and the land uses on both sides of the border are also connected. So I drew these maps. They're a little hard to see here. In my 1990 book, we actually tried to map. We interviewed commuter workers coming from Tijuana into San Diego. We asked them where they lived and where they worked and what their industry was, and we tried to plot these on a map to see if we could find any labor market patterns. We also interviewed people who were shopping, and of course we found, you can see the darker shares of the pie are where people go to shop. So there was a kind of a distance decay effect. The farther from the border, the less shoppers. Most of the shoppers that were crossing were trying to shop locally, either in San Isidro or in Chula Vista or the South Bay area, which conforms to an old geographic rule called central place theory, which says that people will trade off distance and the type of product they buy, so distance being directly correlated. When you cross the border to shop in the United States, if you're going to go to Target, or you're going to go to Walmart, or you're going to go to another less expensive CVS pharmacy, you're going to probably look for one in the South Bay area, because why drive all the way to North County for the same store that you could find closer by? But you're looking for that type of purchase on the San Diego side of the border. So that tells me that, and what I argued in the book, is that consumers are behaving rationally, but they're behaving rationally in a transnational space, not just in their own countries. So my argument was that if the rules of this old idea of central place theory, which says that all shoppers behave rationally, they trade off how far they go and what product they want to buy. And if that was operating on both sides of the border, then that proved that, and Americans do the same thing in Tijuana. If they need something in Tijuana and they can get it closer to the border, like pharmacies, they're not going to drive 60 miles if they can go to a pharmacy that's a 5-minute walk across the boundary to get some expensive drug that they know they can get in Mexico for a less expensive price. So there is a kind of rational behavior going on, as if it was like a twin city, like St. Paul, Minneapolis. It does operate that way on some level. And then tourism. People cross the border on both sides. You may remember back in, there was a movie, The Titanic, and right after it was filmed, not many people know that the movie, The Titanic, was actually filmed off the coast of Baja California. A lot of the extras in the movie Titanic were Mexicans. They literally had signs that said, "Please dress and look European and come to the show." My friend, one of my best friends who's a professor at SDSU, is from Tijuana. She said that there were literally signs put up, try to look like you're an early 20th century European outfit. And so they put the extras in the movie, and they filmed a lot of the Titanic off the coast of Baja, and they even built a studio down there. And so after they finished the filming, it was such a big deal, people wanted to come to the studio, that they made the studio into a kind of a theme park where you could go look at the filming of the Titanic and all the details of that. And right next to that, of course, many of you may know about Puerto Escondido, which is a lobster place where you can consume all the lobster that your heart desires. And so within that town, which is a very heavily visited town, they created this place called the home of the Titanic, or Via Titanic. And so it became like the lobster capital of the world. And so you would go to like the equivalent of the Disneyland of Titanic. You'd visit the Titanic facility, and then you would go eat lobster in the nearby tourism site. And then, of course, the maquilas, I talked about that already. And the cross-border ecosystem. So this is just a map showing what are called renegade sewer flows, where sewage spills across the border, contaminating sites on the U.S. side of the border. So we're in this together, because if we don't help Mexico deal with its sewage problems, we're going to end up suffering more. It's going to get into our water systems. And equally, we're the ones that are sending all the air pollution. Comes down from L.A., it travels down the coast, and it ends up arriving in Tijuana. So both sides of the border have to clean their environment because the environment doesn't recognize humanly constructed boundaries. Air doesn't recognize boundaries. Birds don't stop at the border. Animals don't stop at the border. The ecosystem is independent of humanly constructed boundaries. A famous geographer once said, nature abhors borders. It doesn't recognize them. So we have to understand that we share nature. The planet can only survive if we're all better stewards of the environment. Whatever side of the border you're on isn't going to matter. You have to clean the environment and protect it, so we have to work together. We have to share our ecosystem, and we've recognized that in treaties that have been signed between the U.S. International Boundary and Water Commission to manage cross-border water, treaties signed after NAFTA to respect the environmental issues on both sides of the border as well. And of course, our linkages transcend to land uses. We've been working together with Tijuana on the future of the actual use of land around the remodeled border crossing. On the left slide, a little bit hard to see, I apologize. And on the right side, you may know that San Diego Association of Governments did a binational corridor strategic plan for Otay Mesa, Mesa de Otay, and you can see they're actually sketching in the use of land on both sides of the border and trying to understand how they can work together to predict and model the future of the border region, understanding the different land use patterns on both sides. So when you tie this all together, you have this giant San Diego-Tijuana cross-border metropolis with a huge economy, $140 billion of annual GDP, all these key sectors like biotech, tourism, defense, education, that are thriving and crossing the border in many cases. 40 million border crossers a year coming by car or foot. 2 million trucks. If you drive out to Otay Mesa and you see the incredible lines of trucks carrying maquila goods across the border and back after they're produced, carrying the inputs and then carrying the final products back across the border. 50,000 people crossing legally to work. Now we have 3 ports of entry. We built a new one on Otay Mesa East. On the new pedestrian crossings, both the one at San Ysidro Ped West and also the Border X, which I'll talk about in a second. So it's a huge cross-border metropolis that extends up and down the coast, nearly 5 million if you go from Rosarito, Ensenada, Tijuana, all the way to the north of San Diego County. And yet there's definitely politics involved here, and so there are challenges. And the challenges are, we talk about, scholars have introduced this concept called debordering and rebordering. And one of the arguments that scholars have made, which I think is a legitimate argument, is that the international borders tend to go through these cycles where, for political reasons, either the border is being removed or it's being brought back. And so I just put up on this chart an example of our region, how from the 1960s through the 1990s, we went slowly evolved to a point where we were starting to relax the meaning of the border. We created, as back as 1960s, the city of San Diego created something called a border area plan. You may not be aware of it, but it's a big document that was published in the 1960s. Then in the 1970s, 2 of the most famous urban designers in North America, Donald Appleyard and Kevin Lynch, came, and they were hired by the city to create a plan called Temporary Paradise. It's been republished very recently, and with a series of new essays, including by yours truly, available at Citizens Coordinates for Century 3. Roger Sholey serves on the board. If you want to get a copy, talk to Roger. Sorry, Roger, I don't want to put you in a position of being a book salesman, but MTB built the trolley down to the border in 1978. The city of San Diego created an Office of Binational Affairs. The county had an Office of Transborder Affairs. Tijuana created an Economic Development Council. Then in the 1990s, we actually signed NAFTA. We built this binational airport. We started talking about a 3rd border crossing. So we were doing a lot of things to cement our connections. And then, of course, 9/11 hit. And then after 9/11, we created the Department of Homeland Security, and there were, obviously the cross-border relationship was not going to be so simple. We needed to rethink it. We needed to be more careful. And so, and many people talk about that as the beginning of kind of a rebordering, of bringing the border back and worrying about things. And of course, then we had problems along our side of the border, there was more drug smuggling and violence, so people were skeptical about crossing the border. And then we had the global recession, and that made it harder for finances to cross the border as well. So we struggled. And then all of a sudden in the 2010s, things got better. Tijuana started going through this resurgence, a lot of new tourism, a lot of new commercial development in downtown, redevelopment, and all of a sudden tourists have been coming back. Tijuana's become, for one thing, one of the gourmet centers of North America, great restaurants, microbreweries, beer. Lots of people like to go down there now to celebrate all of those wonderful cultural, economic things that are going on in Tijuana, and Americans are rediscovering it. It's being written up in the media, and so there's kind of a relaxing of the border. And all of a sudden in 2016, President Trump was elected, and one of his campaign slogans was about building a wall, and he's trying to create that separation again, and he would be somebody who would fall under the category of rebordering. So you can see how, in a way, the border is like a roller coaster. It goes through different cycles, depending on how things are going economically and politically. But we, the people who live on the border, we have to try to survive without letting those cycles absorb us, without being swallowed by those cycles. We have to create a vision of who we are and what our life is about and how we're going to build our economy and keep it together in spite of the ups and downs of larger national issues or even things that happen in the economy that affects everyone. So I'm going to end my lecture. I don't know how long I've been talking. I want to talk a little about this thing called placemaking and why I think that might be an important subject to a tool, if you will, that we can use to help cement and improve the quality of life across the border. Because I want to emphasize the term living space. The border is not just a place to put up a wall, it's a place that people live in on both sides. If you go to San Isidro on the weekend, you will see moms pushing babies, crossing the border back into Tijuana. They've been shopping all afternoon, or picking up their kids who go to school on one side of the boundary or on the other side of the boundary. You have families that come from both sides, that live on both sides of the border. You have business people who work on both sides of the border and meet to talk about different business projects. You have students, college students, who cross into, who go to my university, San Diego State, or go to other universities. So there's a lot of cross-border synergy in this region, and it's a space that people live in. It's not just a space that someone in Washington, D.C. or Mexico City can talk about in an abstract way. It's a real place, and millions of people live there, including all of us. So the reason I chose placemaking is because there's a kind of a movement going on around the world now to use placemaking, and especially the work that's done in what are called public spaces, places that the government can actually have an impact to change things that affect the daily lives of people. Now again, people go to work, they travel through public transit, they shop in public places. It's a place where you can create better public safety. People like to meet their friends in public places, and it's where they relax and engage in their recreational aspects of their daily lives. So urban planners, urban designers, landscape architects, policymakers, city planners in planning agencies understand that you can do great things and help a city by improving the places where people meet. A good example is Times Square in New York City. It was very run down and struggling for many years, and the city of New York has really made an attempt to pedestrianize it, take cars off the street, create much wider spaces for people to sit and talk, and it's moved businesses out onto the sidewalk, restaurants, and it's created a much more safe and utilized ambiance, and it's improved business and the way in which people are able to move around a crowded place like Manhattan. So the steps often involved in placemaking are to identify stakeholders, then get the community to come out and listen to someone talking about an issue, then developing a vision, hopefully doing something that's not super expensive. There's a thing called Lighter, Quicker, Cheaper that's been developed by a guy named Fred Kent, who's been out to San Diego many times to talk about our public spaces, and then reevaluating and refining this vision and continuing to implement it. So, how can we use placemaking as a tool to bring us together to help improve our living spaces in the Tijuana, San Diego region? I'm just going to mention three quick ideas that I think are the beginnings of I think what's becoming more a sort of a movement to begin to think about having a better cross-border San Diego-Tijuana relationship. So when I talk about gateway connections, it's the actual crossing zones. So back in the 1990s, this was a vision that started out by a developer who wanted to build a place called Las Americas, which would be a kind of a shopping mall, a place for shoppers on both sides of the border. And it would be on the U.S. side, but it would have eventually have a pedestrian bridge connecting it to Mexico. And when that idea was first introduced, people said, that's not going to work. Nobody wants to shop at the border. It's too dangerous. It's not a good idea. It's too crowded. It's too chaotic. Terrible idea. Why put the border has to have, police and prisons, and, why are you going to put a shopping facility there? Well, they ended up building it, and it's there, and now there's a pedestrian bridge that crosses into Tijuana, right next to that outlet area. And there's talk about maybe building housing, that people could walk to it nearby, maybe turning it into more of a thriving, daily, functional commercial space. But it was one example of improving, using placemaking to make the border a living space that people could live and shop and work in. This is an example of about 15 years ago, several schools of architecture on both sides of the border got together and asked their students to come up with ideas on what could you do at the border. And they came up with the idea that why does the border have to only be kind of a policed, militarized space where you feel like you're being looked at and surveilled, and bridges and cameras and bars on the walls and fences? Why can't it also have something more human to it? So they came up with the idea of even at a customs facility, there could be cafes on one side, maybe a movie theater as you cross the border and arrive at the other side, that it didn't have to only be a negative experience. It could be a building plaza. It could be a space that people actually live in. And that's, I think, what the future should be about on our border. Now, are there issues? Yes, there are issues. One issue is whether the border zone should be for cars or people. There's been a problem, as you know, that many people cross the border in cars, and it's very, very delayed. There's long lines there, creates a lot of air pollution. There's parking is difficult right at the border, or has been difficult at the border. On both sides, there are issues there. Right now, it's a little confusing when you cross the border how to actually walk to the more interesting parts of downtown Tijuana. So there's still more work to do in terms of wayfinding and creating safe spaces for people to walk around when they arrive in Tijuana. We still have a ways to go. And on our side, San Isidro could be much more walkable. It has a nice village environment, but it's not set up extremely well for when you cross back over from Tijuana and you arrive in San Isidro. The freeways and the cars really overwhelm that environment, and it could be redesigned so that people could have access to some of the walkable parts of the village of San Isidro, which has stores and shops and an interesting atmosphere for people to walk through, including for local folks who go back and forth on a daily basis. So there's a lot more work to do in redesigning this and making it a more livable space and using placemaking techniques to get the community involved in doing exactly that. Now, Tijuana went through this period of resurgence, but it's also, an ongoing project, okay? The congestion, the way the border crossing is designed, the fact that there's too many cars, as I mentioned, the confusing street patterns, the need for wayfinding, some of the blocks are not as compatible for walking, and then, of course, you have suburbs that are being built in Tijuana as well, so people are moving farther out and they're using their cars a lot more. So I think both cities have to decide if the border is this dense, walkable place where you have San Isidro, kind of a village-like scale, fairly concentrated. You have downtown Tijuana, very close to the border. It constitutes the possibility to have a very dynamic and walkable and much more thriving and livable, safe space over the next 20 or 30 years, if both sides make a commitment to engage in this kind of placemaking. Now, you may know that the ULI, Urban Land Institute, did a study in the last 2 years looking at this problem. Tijuana has also been looking at the problem over the last 5 or 10 years. So there's interest on both sides of the border to improve the space. So Tijuana went through 2 phases in its downtown. From 2001, right after 9/11, to 2011, it kind of was abandoned. There was a lot of long lines, and people were afraid to go there. The tourism economy kind of shut down. There was drug smuggling and violence, and we had a global recession 2008. So it was definitely struggling. But then all of a sudden, through local kind of grassroots movements, young people, students, folks who live near downtown, kind of got together and started realizing that we have a lot of high potential places that we could develop better. So they started using those pasajes, the underground pasajes, as cultural spaces and putting microbreweries and art galleries in and having every 2 weeks Friday events there with live music. They began to invest in building new business places and remodeling some traditional places like the Highlight Palace has gone through a remodeling. Caesar's Restaurant was bought up and remodeled and improved. So there's a lot more energy in downtown Tijuana, and people are moving, not only going there, they're moving there. They're building housing in and around the center of downtown Tijuana. So, and I think part of this placemaking and resurgence of downtown Tijuana is that the old identity was that it was just like a tourist place for, Americans would go there, and it hadn't really improved its appeal both for people locally and also for outsiders to come there and want to stay. And I think now it has a new identity as a kind of emerging economic and cultural center of innovation in the creative arts, in cuisine, and it has something, kind of a buzz, that's attracting a lot more people. Journalists from all over the world are coming there and writing about it. And so it's slowly overcoming the negative image. I'm not saying the problem's completely solved, but there are examples of the possibility of it turning into something else. And it's beginning to create a plan. This is from the ULI study, talking about how to redesign it to make it a more attractive place. This is one example of, with more green spaces, trees, recycled water, you could increase the density in downtown Tijuana. People could start to move there and want to live there, just like we've done in San Diego, in certain neighborhoods in San Diego, where we're building up and we're building green and we're attracting residents. And once you have residents, it becomes safer. Eyes on the streets, people feel more comfortable living there. You begin to revitalize the public spaces, the commercial boulevards, and the pasajes. There's a lot of pedestrian scale already in downtown Tijuana. If people were living there and they owned their own condos, they're going to be more inclined to take care of the neighborhood. It completely change it into something much different from what it is now. So my last example, as you know, is the CBX Cross-Border Express. Again, when they first proposed that idea, people said, nobody's going to want to park their car all the way down on the border, cross and use the Tijuana airport. What a stupid idea. Well, it's actually doing really well. People like to use it. The bridge, you walk across, it works really well. You fly out of the Tijuana airport, you can get all over Mexico very quickly. So businessmen who have work in Mexico City or down in Cabo or anywhere else in any of the other big capital cities, Guadalajara, other places in Mexico. Mexicans use it also, Mexicanos who live in San Diego County but are going back to Mexico for different reasons. So it's been a very interesting project, and it connects directly to the Tijuana airport. It was modeled after cross-border ideas used in Europe and other parts of the world. And so it's another example of being able to create a connecting design strategy that makes the border, that overcomes the perception of the border as dangerous and unstable and violent, and makes it into an everyday place where people go to an airport, just like going to downtown to Lindbergh Field in San Diego. You drive to the airport, you park your car, or you take an Uber, you get off, you go into the airport, and you use it like it's part of your everyday life. And now we're saying for tens of thousands of San Diegans that if they want to go south somewhere, they can use this facility in the same way. It's part of the idea of better connecting the two cities. So I want to end with 2 quotes. One is from Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who said recently at a rally in El Paso, Texas, he said, "Here in El Paso, Juarez, 2.5 million people, 2 countries, speaking in 2 languages, with 2 cultures and 2 histories, who come together, are joined, not separated, by the Rio Grande River, forming something far greater and far more powerful than a sum of our parts. It's a cross-border vision. And then San Diego, Tijuana could become the world's greatest transfrontier megalopolis, a high-tech, super modern, trendy, culturally alive, vibrant southwest border version of Hong Kong, a booming business and creative hub where the building blocks that make up a city, cinemas, restaurants, high-rise buildings, nightclubs, transit stations, schools, shopping malls, condos, and master plan communities are so crisply interspersed that the international boundary line becomes practically invisible. Call me a dreamer, but let us hope that this is a metaphor for the kind of world we can look forward to. I gave that talk at commencement to over 10,000 people at SDSU in 2018. I got a huge applause for my comments. And I basically, at the end, I said, we are better than borders. Walls are 19th century. The border living space is 21st century. We have to decide which we want to be. Thank you very much. Of course, I'm more than happy to take questions. I know some of you have comments, perhaps, and I'm more than happy to.
What's the definition of a port of entry compared to someplace like Tecate?
That's a port. Tecate has a port of entry as well.
Oh, okay.
Any place where you have a formal, controlled place where you either go by car or by foot that has customs officials and border patrol and is, you're being screened to cross into the United States, that's a port of entry. Yeah. Yes?
There's been very little discussion of the wall interrupting migratory patterns of animals, etc. Do you have any insight on that?
There is evidence that the flow of, particularly in the more rural parts of the border, that there has been some interruption of, there are people who are studying these phenomena, and they do believe that the wall, a concrete barrier could have an effect on the migration patterns of animals, so that's a concern. Because here in San Diego, we created the multiple species corridor concept where we want to allow animals that migrate from season to season, that go out to the desert, over the mountains, and come to the coast, and then be able to go back, whether it's birds or other animal life. So we tried to create continuous green corridors so those animals could be allowed to do that. Same thing in Los Angeles. They've even created a bridge for, I believe it's mountain lions, so they can get back and forth to their territories when they need to come back from the coastal area and get out into the eastern wilderness. So yeah, a physical wall is always a concern. Yeah.
As a dreamer, I deal with the 5 and the 805, 50,000 people commuting north and south every day. But I also have to deal with the lack of resources and infrastructure to support megalopolis for the San Diego Tijuana region. So I'm wondering how you overcome those constraints to build this megalopolis.
Right. Well, obviously, complicated question. Good question. But first of all, we have to ask, how is our public budget being used? And I'm not going to get into deconstructing the federal budget, but it's clear that a lot of money is wasted in military expenditures that aren't even being spent, sitting in funds for, old equipment that's no longer being used that could be reallocated to better uses. I wrote a report in 2008 that looked at cross-border infrastructure, and I found that SANDAG, the state of California, federal government had allocated for cross-border infrastructure, things like ports of entry, new remodeled ports of entry, highways to the border, that there's all this money that's been allocated, but it hadn't been spent because other problems were usurping that money for other reasons. And it's sitting there as I think of all the money that was allocated, it's only about 30% was actually being spent, and 70% of that money was missing. SANDAG talked about that in their reports as well. So we have to make border infrastructure a priority, and highway infrastructure. I'll tell you another problem. If you look at a map of the San Diego-Tijuana region, you'll notice that most of the freeways run east and west. They don't run north and south. And I said, if these two places are going to be more integrated, if they're responsible for part of the $500 billion in cross-border trade, why don't we have better infrastructure connections? Because right now, to get from Tijuana, from Baja to San Diego, there are only about 3 roads that get north. And then when you look at the highways that go from the from the southern part of San Diego County up through the north, through Orange County and onto LA, there are maybe 2 freeways. So it seemed to me that we need to, and they're not necessarily that wide in some places, and they're not necessarily set up for trucks, which is one of the main things that's going to deliver a lot of the maquila products. So I argued in my report, whereas in Texas, the train connections and the trucking connections across the border are much better. They've done a better job of building cross-border infrastructure in Texas than we have in California. So one thing that we definitely need to do is step up our infrastructure, our mapping, and our understanding of where we actually need to build things and what we actually need. So I don't think it's only money. I think it's how we think about the infrastructure that we actually need, and then I think it's also the politics of how we spend the money and having an agency. There used to be a California-Mexico office, a border office, and then it disappeared. And that's another problem in the state, is that people who live in Northern California are maybe less interested in the issues of our region. I think you saw the other day that the Voice of San Diego was reporting on the state of the state talk by the governor, the new governor, who I like, by the way. But the only thing he said about San Diego is that we had a hepatitis crisis here, and it was a kind of a negative. It was only mentioning San Diego in a negative light. Although I do think the government of California does support the connection between California and Mexico. So hopefully there'll be more sensitivity to that in the future. But yeah, infrastructure is definitely a critical issue. Yeah.
As an academic living here at the moment, looking long-term down the road, do you see a future for xenophobia? Do you think it's something that can actually outlast the economics of it and the migrant flows and all the other concerns for people living south of the border? Is that something that
Well,
you can see as a viable future to keep out the poor, the unwashed, southern part of the
yeah. I think xenophobia and racism are old stories that need to be let go. They're not, they completely miss the point of what California is all about. California is a multicultural place. It's been that way for most of its history. And anyone who doesn't want to accept that is just ignorant. So we have to stop accepting the voices of people who are ignorant and listen to nature, listen to history, listen to culture, pay attention to the reality of the place. So yeah, there's no room for xenophobia in California-Mexico relations. Yeah.
Two things, one is north-south and one is east-west. For north-south, I was wondering if you have any plans for extending the train line down through the border and along the border. I was wondering if you knew of any development for, any development of the riparian zone around the river.
Yes on both. So Tijuana and Baja California has been talking about, for example, trying to connect up with the trolley, the light rail system that we built on our side. Their vision, I think, is actually better. They want to build what's called bus rapid transit, because bus rapid transit, BRT, is really the wave of the future. And the United States is the only country in the world that hasn't embraced it the way it should. If you go to South America now, you go to Bogota, Colombia, they have this Transmilenio, some incredible high-tech, futuristic bus rapid transit line. When I say bus, I don't mean the kind of buses you're thinking of. These are buses that look like trains. They move fast, they have dedicated lanes, they have them in Brazil also. When it gets to a stop, it opens, the platform is raised up, the door opens, and you feel like you're getting into a train. You hop in, and it moves right away. So it moves people quickly, very efficiently. They use green technology. A lot of it is low energy use. It doesn't pollute. So Tijuana is looking at building something like that. They've been talking to different consultants and trying to do it. And they started to build one version, and it hasn't been run as well as people had hoped, so it's not being used to the extent that it should be. But I think that's definitely on the table for the future. And as far as riparian visions for the river, there's a number of different plans that are being looked. There's one plan that wants to put solar panels along the concrete. The Tijuana River, as it goes through downtown Tijuana, has a concrete channel because it's very high flood risk zone. But that concrete channel is kind of ugly, and so people have said, well, what could we do there? One idea is to fill it with water, but the water is expensive and difficult to bring into the region and keep there because in the hot weather it's going to probably dry up. So another vision is to create a kind of a solar-powered garden, which would have trees, but also solar panels that would be a source of solar energy for the city of Tijuana. So that's being discussed right now, and whether or not it's safe to have it there and how that would work technologically, but that's one vision for the river. Now, as you get away from the city, the river could definitely be better protected, and they could put park space around it as other parts of the city similar to Tijuana have done. But that's a great question, yeah.
In the 1960s, City of San Diego annexed the property, beyond Chula Vista South, all the way along the border. Have you analyzed the positives and negatives of that?
Yeah, that was an interesting case. The way they actually, in state law in California says that in order to annex something, it has to be physically adjacent to the city. And so the city was like, how are we going to annex San Isidro if we have two other cities in the way, National City and Chula Vista? So what they did was they annexed like a 20-foot wide piece of land under the bay, all the way down parallel to the coast, and then back connecting to San Isidro. And that's how they annexed San Isidro. So the reason they did that was the city thought that San Isidro would be a valuable extension of the city of San Diego. It has Latino population, which is a lot of Latinos already in the city of San Diego in places like Barrio Logan and Sherman Heights and South Bay. They also believe that the city of San Diego ought to be the one that has jurisdictional responsibility for the border and the border crossing. So that's why it's important. Has it gone extremely well? Well, San Isidro often feels that it's like the forgotten sister of the city. It hasn't always been given the best policy approaches. The city kind of forgets that it's there. And so that's been an ongoing battle. But I think it's gotten much better since the 60s, and there have been very progressive, mostly progressive, more progressive mayors and city council people. Right now we have I think a Democrat majority on our city council, so I think we're going to be entering an era where there's going to be a lot more empathy and interest in our southern brothers and sisters in San Isidro, and hopefully more good projects to better connect San Isidro to the city. But it's a great question because it is a sort of geographic oddity that we have a city, then two separate cities between us and the rest of our city, which is all the way down on the South Bay. A little bit of a challenge, but not impossible, yeah.
I have a question. What do you recommend to the average San Diegan or Tijuanan who wants to contribute to this city, who wants to break the wall and create in just their everyday sort of way? What do you recommend to people that sort of contribute to this conversation in a productive way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Cross the border, shop, especially San Diegans. Don't buy into the idea that it's dangerous, and don't buy into the negative projections about the border. Be part of the border community. Walk across the border. Get to know your Latino neighbors better. Participate in cross-border events and activities. Vote for the right people. Listen to what they say. Make sure that you feel that they're sympathetic to this vision of what the future of this region is about. And every time someone says something stupid, politely, point out. Give them the real information. Politely point. When you hear someone saying, "Oh, the wall's going to keep drugs out," okay, let's go have a beer and talk about this. Let's go have some fentanyl, which came across legally. So yeah, I think just being aware of what's being real, aware of real information, making sure that people don't pass along, erroneous information, participating in this cross-border vision, joining in activities, and keep your eyes open, because there's going to be a lot more, I hope, coming online soon. So, yeah. Good question. Great question. Yeah, Don.
The other thing they can do is buy a Toyota pickup. All the beds on all the Toyota pickups are made into a line. Have you traveled Highway 2 recently and looked at the Maquiadora city that's down there along a railroad line that is in fact being used to transfer stuff across the border?
Is that the one on the road to Tecate? Yeah.
It's from Tecate to Rosarita, pretty
Mhm.
much. And all along the north side of Highway 2 is now just all Maquiadoras. It's huge. I mean, if you want to see a big industrial city, that's where it is.
Yeah.
And it's bigger than anything you can imagine. On the downside, the sewage lawsuit and the meth problem and the murders.
No, there's no question that there is a violence problem, but it's been misrepresented in the media. It's basically small-scale crystal meth dealers who are now trying to carve out little pockets of territory in outer-lying neighborhoods in places like Tijuana, and then they end up fighting each other for control of turf. We have the same battles going on in our cities, but we're not declaring a national emergency over that. So it's misleading to suggest that, yes, there are definitely bad things happening in cities all over the world, including some of the ones on our border. People seem to want to consume drugs. Our country is guiltier than anyone. A lot of our violence is also related to that as well. Opiate addiction and violence is a pretty important phenomenon in the United States. And some of the mass murders that we've had, people were known to have taken opiates and other drugs. So we're not immune to those phenomena, yeah. And to say that just because they're happening in Tijuana is part of some larger story that therefore we need to have a national emergency is a little bit of I would say, a leap, a big leap.
And the San Diego Imperial Beach lawsuit against the IBEW regarding the sewage bill.
I'm really proud of Serge Dedina and his guys down there for stepping up and telling the federal government, you got to deal with this problem. This is a crisis. That's a crisis. The environmental crisis is a crisis. Climate change is a crisis. And when there's that much sewage coming across the border and not being handled properly, then we need to do something about it. Yeah.
Maybe final question, Larry. How do you compare the attitude of Mexico City, the Mexican federal government, to the border versus the U.S. Washington D.C. attitude toward the border?
That's a really good question because for a long time there were similarities, I would say, in terms of, for one, Mexico is a very, very centralized country. So the political power in the government resides in Mexico City. There's a saying in Spanish that I'll translate it. It says, in Mexico, the king, or the president is the king, the governor is the viceroy, and the mayor is the clown. And the reason they have that saying is because traditionally mayors in Mexico were very weak. Whereas in the United States, we've had mayors that have become governors. I might mention a guy named Pete Wilson, who was mayor of San Diego, became governor. Local officials have even made it up to senators. They've become, higher officials. So in the United States, cities have a lot more power. We passed the powers to our cities in the state of California, for example. Early in the 20th century, we passed laws that gave local government, for example, power over zoning. It used to be the state controlled the zoning in your city, and it was passed on to local governments in the 1920s. So our local government system here is much more robust, politically powerful, and therefore when mayors speak out here, they have clout, whereas traditionally in Mexico that wasn't the case. So for many years, the problem of cities like Tijuana and Mexicali is that they wouldn't be able to get anything done because all the tax money goes to the federal budget, and then it reallocates it to the states, and then the states reallocate it to the border, if it gets there. So a lot of projects that needed to get built took a long time to get funded. That is changing. It changed after the presidency of Carlos Salinas. For all the negative things that were written about Carlos Salinas, the one thing he did do is push a law called decentralization. So a lot more power was being shifted from federal to state and local. I'm not saying it's as good as it is in the United States, but it's better. Now, I think that the last couple of presidents have realized that the border is critical to the future of Mexico, and they have to figure out a way to make it work better. Now, I think I heard that the new president, AMLO, says he's going to do like a border Marshall Plan. He wants to reinvest part of Mexico's budget to fixing up the border. And if you may not know that in the 1960s, Mexico did that. They created a plan, a national plan, to strengthen the border. It was called the National Frontier Program, PRONAF, Programa Nacional Fronterizo. It was a big program, and it spent millions of dollars. And part of what it did was it said, the image of our border is that we're like this rundown, dusty, disorganized place, and even tourists aren't going to want to come to Mexico because it doesn't look very nice. So they started fixing it up. And if you remember, it's not there anymore, but the border crossing into Tijuana used to be a beautiful Art Deco kind of building that was one of the most beautiful border crossings. And they existed across the border. So that was built by PRONAF money. They started building nicer border crossings. They started fixing up the commerce near the border and trying to do some infrastructure improvements to improve the visibility, the visual landscape to begin with, because they didn't have enough money to do everything, and maybe also to have more police to lower the crime, to make people feel safer. And it worked pretty well in the 60s. By the 70s, the United States was already talking to Mexico about signing the U.S.-Mexico Tariff Act, 1973, to create the Maquila program. So things got much better after that, and people started coming to, even in the 60s, people were coming to downtown Tijuana and getting their picture taken next to the zebra with the stripes, the donkey with the stripes, and kind of the whole beginning of sort of colorful tourism on the border started then. So to answer, the long answer to your question is that I think the Mexican government has a better understanding of the role the border plays, even though it's far away, that they can't just allocate resources back to the center. They have to really start thinking about making the border work better because their trade relationship with the United States depends on it, on the one hand. And the United States really depends on who the president is, and it's true that in the last couple of administrations, there have been other concerns. When President Obama was elected, he was very sympathetic to Mexico. He came to Mexico, talked with the president, met with the president. He also went to Cuba. He opened up our relationship with Cuba. So he was very open to improving our relationship with Latin America. But he had other stuff on his mind. He inherited, the country was in debt. We were in the middle of an economic crisis, which he fortunately pulled us out of. He also had the Middle East issues. He had to deal with that. So he had a lot of other stuff on his plate. And so same thing with George Bush. He was the second Bush, George W. Bush, was very pro-Mexico. He came from a state that was on the border. He spoke Spanish. He was interested in working with Mexico. He also got hit with 9/11, so he was also distracted. So being president of the United States is a big job, but you cannot forget the importance of our relationship with our Latin American neighbors. Back in the 1960s, President Kennedy, one of our great presidents, he created the Alliance for Progress. He understood that Latin America was the closest giant continent to the United States, and the possibility of trade and great relationships with huge countries like Brazil, where my wife is from, could equal so much more trade and so much more improvement in the quality of life for not only Americans, but also Latin American people. So he was the first president who really shifted our attention toward our neighbors to the south. And ever since then, I think there's been this idea that America is a better place if it builds a better relationship with our neighbors to the south. And so I'll end by saying that I have always thought of the U.S.-Mexico border as a kind of laboratory for how we think about Latin America. This is our opportunity to show that we care about this culture and this place that's right next to us. We're connected, and we're literally connected to Mexico. We have the I'm a professor of architecture, city planning, so I see it through the lens of space. We have the opportunity to physically redesign the space that we share and to engage in many, many great visionary things that could become models for the rest of the world. Instead of focusing on walls and crime and violence and portraying this place in a negative light, we should be reaching across and building something better. That's going to work better for everyone on both sides, and it's really going to help us as a region. So thank you very much for coming out today.